April 7, 1944. Between Leipzig and Auschwitz in Silesia, under Reich control, train number 347 did not stop. It didn't slow down. It didn't change course. The wheels kept a steady rhythm on the frozen rails, striking metal with the cold precision of death in motion. It was 6:47 a.m. Fog lay flat over the fields. The sky had the dull color of ash. In the fourth car, there were 92 people. There had been 93 when the train left Leipzig 2 hours earlier. But 3 seconds after passing kilometer marker 47, something stopped occupying the space assigned to it. Marta Klein was 17 years old. She was 5 feet tall and weighed 90 pounds when she understood there would be no second chance. There was no plan, no signal, no whispered blessing in the dark. Only the metallic sound of the wheels striking the rail joints every 2.3 seconds. The frozen air slicing in through the cracks of the car like invisible knives, and a brutal certainty etched into every cell of her body. If she didn't jump in that instant, she never would. The car was 30 feet long and 8 feet wide, packed with 93 bodies pressed against wood and steel, 51 men and 42 women. Shallow breaths, the smell of fear, sweat, urine no one could control anymore. The ventilation slit near the ceiling measured 12 inches wide and 6 inches high. Too narrow for a man, too high to reach without help. But Marta weighed 90 pounds, and she had learned something in months of hunger. When the body shrinks, instinct sharpens. No one screamed when she moved toward the side wall. Screaming was an invitation to death. Everyone knew where they were going. They had seen the smoke from Treblinka. They had heard the rumors about Sobibor. They had read it in the guards' eyes. The truth no official document ever confirmed. This wasn't a transfer to labor camps. It was a journey toward the end. In that car, silence was the last act of dignity they had left. Marta wasn't tall. Her hands were small, delicate. Hands that once sewed silk dresses for German women who stopped meeting her gaze in 1938. Now those same hands clutched splintered wood with a strength that didn't come from muscle, but from terror, rage, and a pure refusal to die as a number on a typed list. She pushed with her legs. Her feet dropped first, searching for support where nothing existed. The wind lashed her face like a whip. The train was moving at 32 miles per hour. She didn't look down. She didn't think about the angle of the fall or calculate odds. For exactly 3 seconds, 1, 2, 3, her body hung between two destinies, one already written in official files, and another completely unknown, made of dirt, darkness, pain, and the statistical possibility of dying on impact. She jumped. The impact was hard and violent, as if the ground were trying to reject her. The world spun. Sky, forest, tracks, snow collapsing into a chaos her mind couldn't organize. The air tore out of her lungs in a soundless scream no one heard. Her left shoulder cracked as it hit first. Her jaw slammed into a stone buried beneath the snow. Her right knee twisted. She tasted metal as blood filled her mouth before understanding the simplest and hardest truth of her life. She was alive, and the train kept moving. The wheels kept striking the rails. The 92 people still inside kept breathing in the dark, unaware that one of them was no longer there. Unaware that a perfect system had just failed for the first time in 108 miles of track. Up front, in the escort car, the count had already begun. It was standard procedure. Every 50 kilometers, 3 checks per transport. It never failed. Until now. Fourth car, men 51, women 42, said Private Carl Weiss, 22 years old, reading from the typed list he had checked 3 times before leaving Leipzig at 4:47 that morning. Pstitrium. Untersturmführer Ernst Bauer looked up from the mobile desk, where he kept a meticulous record of every transport he had supervised since March 1943. He was 29 years old, held a degree in railway administration from the University of Berlin, and possessed an almost religious conviction that numbers do not lie. For Bauer, numbers were the only truth in a world saturated with propaganda and deception. They had no ideology. They did not argue. They simply existed. He repeated it calmly, without raising his voice. Fourth car, 93 at departure, now 92. Bauer remained silent for exactly 11 seconds. His right hand, holding a Mont Blanc fountain pen inherited from his father, hovered half a centimeter above the paper. His mind, trained to process data with mechanical precision, ran through every possibility. An error in the initial count. Unlikely, he had verified it himself. A death during transit. Possible, but protocol required immediate notification. An escape. Impossible. The cars were sealed from the outside, and still the equation refused to close. 93 minus 92 equaled 1, a missing number, a fracture in the system. Bauer stood up, walked to the driver's cab, lifted the field telephone that linked all cars, and spoke the 3 words that would turn Marta Klein into the only person whose trace the SS would never fully close. Stop the train. The convoy halted 7 kilometers later, at 7:04 a.m., at a nameless point between Königszelt and Risenbach. The dogs arrived first, 3 German shepherds trained to track in sub-zero temperatures. Then came the flashlights, then the shouting. 9 soldiers ran back along the tracks over frozen gravel, under clear orders. Do not fire until the target is confirmed. But when they reached kilometer 47 at 7:31, there was nothing. No body. Not enough blood to certify a death. Only trampled snow along the embankment, broken branches 4 meters from the rails, and a silence that smelled of impossibility. Bauer ordered the search expanded. First 200 meters on each side, then 500, then a full kilometer. The dogs barked, ran in circles, lifted their ears, but found nothing. Flashlights swept tree trunks, snow-covered brush, shadows that looked like bodies and turned out to be branches. And the longer the search continued, the more something unfamiliar grew inside Bauer. A sensation he had never experienced in 18 months of supervising transports. The feeling of having lost something that was not supposed to be lost. Because in SS records, a missing person was not just a number written in red ink. It was a failure, a crack, written proof that the system was not perfect. And if the system was not perfect, then the ideological architecture supporting it wasn't either. Ernst Bauer had devoted his career to refining that system, not out of fanaticism, but out of mathematical obsession. In a chaotic world, bureaucracy seemed to him the only possible form of order. That night, at 9:34 p.m., when the teams returned empty-handed, he wrote in his personal report, Marta Klein, Jewish, 17 years old, Leipzig, lost during transit. No body confirmed, no logical explanation. In that moment, Marta ceased to be a prisoner and became a ghost, one that would haunt Nazi bureaucracy for 41 days. Tell me in the comments which city and country you're watching from. I want to know from where you're standing with those whom history tried to silence. In April 1944, the Third Reich was losing the war on 2 fronts, but it was still winning the race against time to erase every trace of its most organized crime. Trains bound for Auschwitz-Birkenau departed every 48 hours from dozens of occupied cities, and Leipzig in Upper Silesia was one of the key nodes in the entire machinery. From there, convoys left loaded mostly with German and Czech Jews who still remained after 6 years of systematic deportations. The mechanism worked with an industrial precision that would have impressed any engineer. Each transport was recorded in 3 copies, one for the train commander, one for the destination camp, and one for the Central Archives in Berlin. Every railcar had a number. Every person was counted 3 times. When boarding, during the journey every 50 kilometers, and again on the selection ramp. There was no room for mistakes and no space for improvisation, because in Nazi logic, an error was not merely administrative, it was ideological. If the system failed, the promise of total control fractured. If a person vanished from the records, so did the illusion that everything was under control. Routes were studied in detail to avoid large populations. Trains cut through dense forests, open fields without witnesses, and small villages where people had learned not to look, to close their curtains when they heard the familiar sound of wheels, to pretend that metallic rhythm was not what everyone knew it was, the sound of extermination in motion. Between 1942 and 1944, roughly 437,000 people were deported from Upper Silesia to extermination camps. Fewer than 3% survived. The records were meticulous, the numbers exact, the files complete, except for one line, a single blank line, a name without resolution. Marta Klein was born on March 17, 1927 in Leipzig. She was the daughter of Moses Berg, a tailor with a workshop on Olauer Strasse, and Ruth Lovenstein, a piano teacher who gave private lessons on Gartenstrasse. They lived in a 3-room apartment on the 2nd floor of a red brick building where Sundays smelled of braided bread and cinnamon, and on Fridays, before nightfall, Ruth lit 2 candles that cast uneasy shadows on the walls. Marta was the youngest of 3 children. Jacob, 21, studied medicine at the university. Esther, 19, worked in her father's shop, sewing hems with a precision Moses always praised. Little Marta inherited her father's skilled hands, her mother's perfect ear, and a habit Ruth noticed early on, watching silently before speaking. "You think too much," her mother would say, smiling. "I think just enough," Marta replied. In 1938, when she was 11, she watched 3 men wearing red armbands paint a yellow star on the door of their building. She didn't ask what it meant. She already knew. Jewish children in Germany didn't need hatred explained to them. They learned it in the looks of classmates who stopped speaking to them, in teachers who no longer called them by name, in shop windows marked with signs reading, "Jews not welcome." That night, her father closed all the curtains and gathered the family in the kitchen. "From now on," Moses said, his voice calm but firm, "we must be invisible. Don't draw attention. Don't respond to provocation. Surviving is more important than being right." Marta was 11, and she understood perfectly. They had entered survival mode. In November 1938, during Kristallnacht, the synagogue where her family had prayed for 3 generations was destroyed. Across Germany, 209 synagogues were burned and 30,000 Jewish men arrested. Marta's father was spared only because he hid in the basement of a non-Jewish neighbor who still remembered how Moses had given him a wedding suit when he couldn't afford to pay for one. A debt of cloth and stitching saved his life that night. In 1941, her father was sent to a forced labor camp in Gross Rosen, 60 kilometers west of Leipzig. Moses Berg was 52 years old, with a craftsman's hands and a weak heart. Details no one in the Nazi administration considered relevant. He was given 12 hours to say goodbye. He embraced his wife, kissed his 3 children, and before leaving, he said to Marta, "Remember this. Being Jewish is not a weakness. It's proof that we come from people who survived impossible things." You will survive too. Those were his last words. She never saw him again. Moses Berg died of pneumonia in Gross Rosen on February 4, 1942, barely 3 weeks after his arrival. His death was entered into Camp Medical Report number 1847 with a cold, literal cause: respiratory failure due to prolonged exposure. In practice, he had been forced to work 14 hours a day in sub-zero temperatures without adequate clothing until his body simply gave out. In 1942, Jacob, Marta's older brother, disappeared after a routine police check on Schweitnitzerstrasse. He was 22. His papers were in order. He was walking to a friend's house when 2 officers stopped him to verify documents. He never came back. There was no letter, no body, no grave. Only an empty place at the Friday table that no one dared to name, but everyone looked at. After that, Ruth stopped playing the piano. Music requires hope, and hope had become a luxury they could no longer afford. In November 1943, the authorities shut down the Berg family's tailor shop by way of a 3-line decree: Jewish business, mandatory liquidation, owners evicted. They were given 48 hours to pack 20 kilograms of belongings per person. Everything else, the furniture Moses had bought with years of savings, Ruth's piano, photographs spanning 3 generations, the dresses Esther would never finish sewing, would be confiscated for redistribution among German citizens. Marta chose a gray wool coat that had belonged to her grandmother, a photograph of her parents on their wedding day, and a book of poems by Heinrich Heine that her mother had given her on her 15th birthday. On the first page was a handwritten dedication: "For Marta, who thinks before she speaks and observes before she acts. May these words remind you that beauty exists even in the darkest times." She didn't know she would never see that book again, that she would lose it somewhere between the jump and the impact, that Heine's beauty would end up buried beneath the snow of Upper Silesia. They were transferred to the temporary Leipzig ghetto, a 4-story building without heating on Wallstrasse, where 340 people waited for transport to the camps. Marta, her mother Ruth, and her sister Esther shared an 18-square-meter room with 19 other women. They slept on the floor, on thin blankets. They ate black bread and cabbage soup once a day. Every morning at 6 sharp, an officer read aloud the names of those who would depart that night. On April 6, 1944, he read 3 in a row: Ruth Berg, Esther Berg, Marta Berg. Her mother didn't cry. She didn't scream or cling to anyone. She simply took her daughter's hands and said firmly, "We will stay together, no matter what. Together." But Marta, who had inherited from her father the ability to read between the lines, knew the truth. On the transports, families did not stay together. The strong went one way, the weak another. The older ones disappeared first, and her mother was 49. That night, in the darkness of the shared room, an elderly woman whose name Marta never learned whispered in her ear, "If you see an opportunity, take it. It doesn't matter how impossible it seems or whether you think you'll die. Because dying while trying is better than dying without having tried anything." Marta didn't answer, but she stored those words somewhere deeper than memory, in the same place where she kept the image of her father saying goodbye and the sound of her mother's piano. The next morning, at 4:47, 93 people were pushed into the 4th car of train number 347. Among them, Marta Klein squeezed her mother's hand with a strength she had never used before, because deep down she knew it would be the last time. The door slammed shut. The lock was sealed, and the train began moving east, toward Auschwitz-Birkenau, toward the end of almost everything, but not of Marta. The inside of the rail car was as dark as a tomb. The only light came through the slit near the ceiling, a gray rectangle 12 inches by 6, mocking everyone with its impossible promise of escape. Marta stood in the rear corner, wedged between her mother and a woman who couldn't stop shaking. There was no room to sit, not enough air to draw a full breath. Only the smell of compressed bodies, fear turned into sweat, urine no one could hold back anymore because there was no bucket that could serve 93 people. During the first hour, no one spoke. The train moved slowly past the last houses of Leipzig, and Marta watched through the slit. She saw people at their windows, children walking to school, shopkeepers opening their stores, a man reading the newspaper in a cafe. Ordinary life. As if 200 meters away, there wasn't a sealed car full of people who knew they were going to die. No one looked at the train, because looking meant admitting, and admitting meant becoming complicit. Ruth held her daughter's hands without saying a word. There was nothing to say. Esther kept her eyes closed, her lips moving in a silent prayer no one could hear. In the second hour, the train picked up speed. The city disappeared. There were only snow-covered fields stretching to the horizon, dark forests, and a leaden sky the color of ash. Someone asked for water. No one had any. A woman began whispering a prayer in Hebrew. An old man coughed without stopping, each fit weaker than the last. Marta kept her eyes fixed on the slit. Her mother recognized that look. It was the same one Marta had when she decided to learn sewing at 9. The same one when she insisted on memorizing Heine's poems at 14. The look of someone who doesn't just think, but plans. "No," Ruth whispered. Marta didn't answer. Marta. "No, Mom," she said, without looking away. "Do you remember what Papa told me before he left? Don't do this. He said I would survive, and I'm going to survive. Not like this." "Then how?" Ruth asked. When she closed her eyes, tears ran down her dust-covered face. "If you jump, you'll die. If I don't jump, I'll die anyway. At least this way." The sentence never ended. It was the last complete conversation they ever had. At 6:44 a.m., Marta moved toward the wall of the car, and no one stopped her because everyone had thought the same thing. Everyone had looked at that slit. But only she was small enough. Only she weighed 90 pounds. Only she had hands trained to climb splintered wood. She pushed off, placing her feet on the shoulders of two men who understood without words. They held her steady and lifted her upward. Her hands caught the edge. The wood tore open her palms. She felt the blood before she felt the cold from outside. And then she saw it. Forest. Snow. Freedom at 32 miles per hour. Below her, her mother screamed her name once. Then she went silent, because she understood that any more screaming would condemn her. Marta slid her arms through the slit first, then her head. The wind lashed her face. The train roared. The wheels hammered the rails. Every part of her body screamed at her not to do it. But her father had told her she would survive, and she believed him. She jumped. 3 seconds of free fall. 1, the world spun. 2, the sky traded places with the ground. 3, impact. The hit was like having every bone torn out at once. She rolled 11 meters down the snow-covered embankment. Her shoulder dislocated with a crack she heard before she felt it. Her jaw struck a stone. Her mouth filled with blood. Her knee twisted at an impossible angle. She lost consciousness for 9 minutes. When she woke up, the train was gone. There was only the silence of the forest, and a certainty burned into every shattered nerve of her body. Keep moving, or die here. She crawled. She couldn't walk. Her left arm hung useless. Every breath felt like swallowing crushed glass. But she moved inch by inch, tree by tree, because stopping meant freezing, and freezing meant Bauer would win. She didn't know his name yet, but she knew someone would come looking, because in the Nazi system, no one disappeared without consequences. She spent the first night hidden in a hollow between the roots of a massive oak, shivering without fire or food, not knowing whether she would live to see morning. She listened to the forest breathe, the wind moving through branches, the crunch of snow, and far away, like an echo pulled straight from a nightmare, the barking of dogs searching for her. The second night she found an abandoned barn 3 kilometers from the tracks. The walls were riddled with holes and the roof leaked, but there was dry straw, and straw meant warmth. She burrowed into it like a wounded animal and slept a nightmare-filled sleep in which her mother screamed her name again and again. For 11 days, Marta moved only at night. She learned how to walk in darkness without making a sound. She avoided roads and lights. She drank from frozen streams that burned her throat and ate whatever she could find. Roots torn out with her fingernails. Bark chewed until it turned to pulp. Snow mixed with dirt that made her gag but kept her alive. Her body became something she no longer recognized when she saw her reflection in frozen puddles. 82 pounds, a face gray as ash, cracked lips that bled when she tried to speak, and yet her eyes were still alive, because survival was not a conscious choice. It was an instinct older than any ideology, older than hatred, older than war. On the third day, she heard German voices less than 100 meters away and hid inside a bush for 6 hours without moving. The soldiers passed so close she could smell the tobacco from their cigarettes. On the 5th day, the pain in her dislocated shoulder was so intense she passed out twice. She reset it herself, bracing it against a tree and pushing with all her weight. The crack was horrific. The relief was immediate. On the 7th day, she found an abandoned hunter's cabin with 3 cans of pea soup, dated 1941. She opened them with a stone and ate with her fingers straight from the can, the first real food in a week. She cried while she ate, not from relief but from rage, because her mother would never taste pea soup again. On the 12th day, just before dawn, she reached a village called Estrigau. The streets were empty. She saw a Catholic church with its door slightly open and a faint light inside, and she made the most dangerous decision she had made since the jump. She went in. An elderly priest was preparing the altar for the 6 o'clock Mass. His name was Father Matthias Schreiber. He was 61 years old, his hair white as snow, his hands trembling from arthritis. He had been hiding Jews in the church basement for 19 months. By then, he had saved 14 people. All were still alive. All but one had managed to obtain false papers and flee toward liberated territories. When he saw Marta standing in the doorway, filthy, bleeding, shaking, barely able to remain upright, he didn't ask her name. He didn't ask where she came from or what she had done. He only said calmly, "Are you hungry?" Marta nodded, unable to speak. She hadn't used her voice in 12 days. "Then eat first," he said, "and then sleep. We'll deal with the rest later." That later lasted 47 days. Marta remained hidden in a room behind the altar, no bigger than a closet, with a small window facing the cemetery. Father Matthias treated her shoulder with bandages and warm compresses. He gave her clean clothes that had belonged to his niece, who had died of tuberculosis in 1940. He taught her how to pray in Latin so that if someone entered suddenly, she could pass as a novice preparing to take her vows. But every night, Marta had the same nightmare. She was back in the rail car. The train was moving. Her mother was screaming her name, and when she tried to jump again, her hands couldn't reach the slit. She was trapped. The train kept going, toward Auschwitz, toward the ramp, toward the chambers. She woke up screaming. Father Matthias would come with a candle and a cup of linden tea. "Dreams can't kill you," he would say gently. "They only remind you that you're still alive." On May 29, 1944, Father Matthias obtained false documents for her. A forger in Krakow, a Polish printer named Jerzy Kowalski, who charged 200 marks per identity, had built an entire life on paper. Name, Anna Bergman. Age, 19. Place of origin, Munich, Bavaria. Religion, Catholic. Occupation, nursing student. Assigned post, assistant at a field hospital near Krakow. "It's not perfect," Father Matthias warned her. "If someone digs deep enough, they'll discover that Anna Bergman doesn't exist. But in wartime, no one has time to dig deep. There are too many real dead to worry about fake living." Marta held the papers with trembling hands. They weren't just documents. They were a passage back into existence. The possibility of being someone with a name and a history again, not a missing number in SS files. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Matthias smiled with the exhaustion of someone who had seen too much cruelty and still insisted on choosing decency. "Because if I don't," he said, "what's the point of being a priest? What's the point of believing in a God who asks us to love our neighbor if we don't do it when it matters most?" Marta hugged him lightly, quietly, with the kind of gratitude that comes from understanding that some people are willing to risk their lives for strangers. On June 3, 1944, Anna Bergman arrived at a field hospital on the outskirts of Krakow. It was a 3-story building that had once been a school and was now filled with wounded German soldiers returning from the Eastern Front. Arms were missing. Legs were missing. Eyes were missing. Futures were missing. Anna worked the night shift. She cleaned gangrenous wounds, changed bandages soaked in pus and blood, held the hands of 19-year-old boys who called for their mothers before dying. No one suspected anything because she spoke little, asked no questions, and never drew attention to herself. When someone asked where she was from, she answered with a shy smile, "From a place that no longer exists." Technically, it wasn't a lie. In Leipzig, Ernst Bauer kept searching. For the first 23 days after the escape, he dispatched teams whenever a transport passed near the area. He interrogated 47 farmers, offered rewards of 500 marks for information, and threatened arrests. Dogs combed 14 square kilometers of forest. Patrols searched 31 farms, 18 basements, and 12 stables. They found nothing. On May 15, 1944, Bauer received a direct order from Hauptsturmführer Wilhelm Krauss. Marta Klein case. Closed due to presumed death without confirmation. No further search authorized. Resources reassigned to priority transports. Bauer obeyed. But in his personal archive, he kept a manila folder with Marta Klein handwritten in block letters on the cover. Inside were photographs of the site, maps of the area, interrogation lists, and a single note on the last page. Never found. Never explained. First documented failure in 18 months of service. That folder was discovered in 1947 by British investigators during the denazification process. It became one of the most studied documents of the post-war period, not because it proved a crime, there were thousands that did, but because it proved something more unsettling. That someone had escaped a system designed to allow no escapes. Historians analyzed routes, testimonies, dates, and probabilities, and reached an uncomfortable conclusion. Marta Klein jumped from a moving train at 32 miles per hour, survived a fall of several meters, evaded SS search teams with trained dogs for 23 days, crossed 43 kilometers of occupied territory with a dislocated shoulder, and vanished into a network of false documents without leaving a trace that could ever be recovered. According to a statistical analysis conducted by Dr. Kerman Weisse of Heidelberg University in 1953, the probability of survival was 0.4%. But it happened. Otto Hahn, the soldier who conducted the first head count, wrote in his personal diary on April 19, 1944, "There is something strange about this case. It's not that the girl escaped. It's that she vanished, as if the earth itself swallowed her." Bauer is obsessed. He rereads the reports every night and says he can't close a case without a body. I think he can't close it because it represents his first failure, and for men like him, a failure is worse than 1,000 deaths. And in a way, that was true. Because Marta Klein did not die in the fall. She did not die of cold. She did not die of hunger or infection. She died only in Nazi records, while she remained alive, breathing, bleeding, surviving. The war ended on May 8, 1945. Anna Bergman was still working at the Krakow hospital when Soviet troops entered the city, firing into the air in celebration. She didn't celebrate. She didn't cry or embrace anyone. She kept working, because working meant not thinking, and not thinking meant not remembering the rail car, the jump, her mother screaming her name. 3 months passed before she dared to say her real name out loud. It was an August afternoon. She was alone in the supply room when suddenly, like someone had granted her permission, she said, "My name is Marta Klein." She said it again. "My name is Marta Klein." And again, until it stopped sounding strange and became true again. Later, she told a Polish nurse named Christina, who had become her only friend. Christina cried because she too was Jewish, because she too had survived with false papers, and because both of them understood the cost of staying alive when almost everyone else was dead. In September 1945, Marta wrote her name on a Holocaust survivor search form administered by the International Red Cross. It was a yellowed sheet with 47 lines asking for name, date of birth, last place of residence, names of relatives, and the last time they had been seen alive. It took 6 months to receive an answer. Moses Berg, father, died at Gross Rosen concentration camp on February 4, 1942. Cause pneumonia. Ruth Berg, mother, died at Auschwitz-Birkenau on April 9, 1944. Selected upon arrival, gas chamber, no prisoner number assigned. Jacob Berg, brother, died between Treblinka and other transports. Exact date unknown. Estimated between August and October 1942. Esther Berg, sister, died at Auschwitz-Birkenau on April 9, 1944. Selected upon arrival, gas chamber, no number assigned. The 92 people in the fourth car of train number 347 were murdered between April 7th and April 9th, 1944. Only 11 survived the initial selection. Of those 11, only 3 were still alive when the camp was liberated in January 1945. Marta Klein was the only one from that transport who never arrived, the only one who escaped the system, the only one whose name appeared on the departure list, but not on the arrival records. That blank line became her unintended legacy, the proof that the system could fail. When she read the results, she didn't cry or scream. She closed her eyes and, for one endless moment, she was back in the rail car again, holding her mother's hand, hearing her voice say no as she climbed toward the slit. And then she understood the most brutal truth of her survival. She did not survive because she was stronger, or smarter, or because she deserved to live more than the others. She survived because for 3 seconds, she chose the impossible over the inevitable, and her 92 companions in the car never had that choice. In 1947, Marta emigrated to Argentina. She was one of 300,000 Holocaust survivors trying to begin again in places where no one knew their names or their stories. She arrived in Buenos Aires in September with a borrowed suitcase, $40 donated by the Red Cross, and 2 identities, the real one and the false one. She chose to keep the real one. In 1950, she married Thomas Lewandowski, a Polish engineer who had survived 5 years in prisoner of war camps. He understood silence. He understood nightmares. He understood that some stories are not told. They are carried. They had 2 children, David, born in 1952, and Miriam in 1954. Marta opened a small tailor shop in Once, the heart of Buenos Aires' Jewish neighborhood, and for 40 years she did not speak of Leipzig. She did not speak of the train. She did not speak of those 3 seconds. Her children grew up without knowing their mother had jumped from a Nazi train. Her grandchildren grew up without knowing their grandmother had been hunted by the SS for 23 days. Marta had learned something essential in that dark railcar. Silence was not weakness. It was survival. To speak meant to relive, and to relive was to die a little each time. It wasn't until 1989 that her name resurfaced in public documents. That year, a German historian, Dr. Klaus Hoffmann, published a study titled Incomplete Transports, Documented Failures in the Nazi Deportation System, 1942-1945. In it, Marta Klein's name appeared again. Hoffmann had identified 37 cases across Europe of people who vanished during transports without confirmed deaths. Of those 37, he managed to trace 12 survivors. The rest had died without records or been lost in the chaos of the war. He sent letters to 340 addresses in Argentina, searching for survivors of transports that had departed Leipzig between 1943 and 1944. Only one person replied. The letter, handwritten on yellowed paper, read, "Dr. Hoffmann, my name was Marta Klein. I jumped from train number 347 on April 7, 1944, near kilometer marker 47 between Leipzig and Auschwitz. I survived by a statistically impossible stroke of luck, but the 92 people who did not jump were never given even that chance. That is the number that matters. Not the one who escaped, but the 92 who could not. My mother died in the gas chamber 2 days after I jumped. My sister died there as well. Had I stayed, I would have died with them. But then there would be no one left to remember their names. I did not survive out of heroism, but out of instinct, and I have carried that survival as a debt I will never be able to repay. You may use my story for your research, but remember this. I am not special. I had 3 seconds of opportunity, and I took them. That does not make me a heroine. It makes me fortunate. And fortune, in war, is the most unjust privilege of all. Sincerely, Marta Klein, now Lewandowski, Buenos Aires, Argentina. The letter was published in Hoffmann's study and altered how many historians understood the Holocaust. For decades, the narrative had been one of passive victims and active perpetrators. Marta represented something more complicated: individual resistance inside a system designed to erase all individuality. In 1995, at the age of 68, Marta was invited to testify at the Holocaust Museum in Washington. She flew from Buenos Aires with her daughter Miriam, who had spent years urging her to tell her story. She walked onto the stage, sat before a microphone, and faced an audience of 240 people expecting a tale of heroism. For 11 seconds, she said nothing. She simply looked at them, as if counting, checking, making sure they were truly there. Then she spoke, calmly, without drama, like someone describing something so distant it no longer stabbed sharply, only burned with a dull, constant ache. She told of the fall, the forest, the priest, the false papers, the hospital, the war, and the long silence afterward. And at the end, she said something none of the 240 people in the room ever forgot. I am not a heroine. I am a survivor, and there is an enormous difference between the two. A heroine chooses to save others. A survivor chooses only not to die. I did not save anyone. I saved myself. And for 50 years, I did not know if that was enough. If I had the right to be alive when 92 people died in that same rail car. If my survival was a gift or a sentence. Now, at 68, she understood she didn't have to choose. She was both, and always had been. Someone in the audience asked whether she had forgiven the Nazis. A long, heavy silence followed. Then she answered, "You don't forgive the unforgivable. You live with it, or you die from it. I chose to live, not because of the Nazis, but in spite of them. Because every day I breathe is a day they failed to take from me. And that, in its small and insignificant way, is my revenge." Marta Klein died on March 14, 2003 in Buenos Aires, at the age of 76. She was buried beside her husband in the Jewish cemetery of La Tablada. 150 people attended, half family, half Holocaust survivors who knew her story. On her gravestone, a single phrase was engraved in German, one she had written into her will. Ich bin gesprungen. I jumped. It doesn't say where she landed. It doesn't say whether she survived. It doesn't explain why she did it. It only says that she did. And in the end, that was enough. In Germany, the SS file bearing Marta Klein's name remains open in the Federal Archives in Berlin. Any researcher can request it. It arrives in a manila folder the size of a notebook. Inside are 23 pages of reports, 7 search maps, 14 photographs of the site, 47 testimonies from interrogated farmers, and one final handwritten line by Ernst Bauer, dated May 15, 1944. Case closed administratively. Never closed humanly. Bauer never signed the official document certifying her death. The body was never found. Her death was never proven. And in the historical records of the Second World War, Marta Klein appears in a category created for her alone. Escaped. No confirmed trace. Unique case in the Leipzig registry. The Gestapo searched for her for 23 days. Dogs tracked 14 square kilometers. Soldiers interrogated 47 farmers. Bauer wrote 11 official reports. Krauss closed the case 3 times on paper. They never found her. Because Marta didn't just jump from a train. She jumped out of the system, out of the records, out of the logic that claimed Jews did not escape, that 17-year-old girls did not survive, that numbers always balanced. In doing so, she left a void in the Nazi archives, a gap that not even 60 years of historical research managed to fully close. Martha Köhler-Kiegelt, the farmer who saw Marta fall that April morning, died in 1981 at the age of 89. In her will, she left a sealed letter to be opened only after her death. Her children found it in a locked drawer. The letter, written in 1979, read, "To whom it may concern. On April 7, 1944, I saw a girl fall from a train that passed near my home. I was 52 years old and hanging laundry. The train passed as it always did, but that morning something was different. I saw the body fall. I saw it roll down the embankment. I saw it disappear into the forest. I did not report it. I did not help. I did nothing. For 37 years, I have lived with that image, with the question of whether she survived, with the guilt of having remained silent. I do not know if I did the right thing. Perhaps my silence saved her. Perhaps my silence made me complicit. But if she survived, I want her to know this. Someone saw her. Someone knew she was there. And someone kept her secret. Not out of courage, but because in that moment, silence was the only human thing I could do. The letter was delivered to the Berlin Holocaust Museum in 1983. 2 years later, during a conference on civilian testimony in wartime, someone showed it to Marta. She read it in silence. For several minutes, she said nothing. She simply held the paper with trembling hands. Then she closed her eyes, and for one immeasurable instant, she was 17 again, falling from the train. She felt the wind, the fear, the absolute certainty that there was no other option. And then she opened her eyes and smiled. "I survived," she whispered. "She kept my secret, and I stayed alive because I kept staying alive. Not just the jump, not just the forest, not just the war, not just the hunger, not just the nightmares. I survived forgetting. Some stories end in victories, others end in defeats, and some end in a void no one ever fully manages to explain. Marta Klein's story belongs to that last kind. There are no statues bearing her name, no streets that remember her, no Hollywood films. There is only an incomplete file in a German museum, a gravestone in Buenos Aires with 3 words in German, and a question the SS was never able to answer with certainty. How a 41-kilogram girl vanished in the middle of a system designed so that no one vanished without a trace. The answer lives in those 3 seconds no one saw, in the fall no one recorded, in the silence of a farmer who chose not to speak, in the kindness of a priest who chose to risk his life, in the hand of a Polish printer who for 200 marks manufactured identities, and above all, in the will of a young woman who chose the void over the certainty of death. In those 3 seconds, Marta stopped being a number on a list and became the ghost that followed Ernst Bauer until his death in 1979. Because Bauer never stopped looking for her, not during the war, not after. In 1963, retired and living under a false name in Munich, working as an accountant for a railway company, an irony he surely noticed, he received an anonymous letter. No return address, no signature. Just 3 handwritten words in German. Ich bin gesprungen. I jumped. Bauer placed the letter in a desk drawer. He never showed it to anyone. He never spoke of it. But every night before going to sleep, he opened that drawer, looked at those 3 words, and understood the truth he had tried to ignore for 19 years. He hadn't lost Marta Klein because of an administrative error. She had won. She won because she stayed alive when the system said she should die. She won because she disappeared from records meant to be infallible. She won because every day she breathed proved the perfect system wasn't perfect, and that was the only defeat Bauer was never able to erase from his personal files. He died in 1979 of a heart attack, alone in a small Munich apartment. No family, no friends. Surrounded by perfectly ordered dossiers no one wanted to inherit. Among his belongings were the manila folder labeled Marta Klein and the anonymous letter with its 3 words. No one knew what to do with them. They were sent to the Federal Archives, where they remain to this day, open to anyone who wants to read about the only person the Leipzig SS never managed to close in its records.